Consider the position of workers on the day after Workers' Day. It's also important to consider the bodies that represent workers. I'm talking, of course, about unions. Unions do all sorts of things. They represent workers in wage talks. They provide legal representation for workers when they're accused of wrongdoing. In many countries, including our own country, they've also pushed for political change. Look at the role of unions during apartheid, or, to use a very different example, the role they played in Poland at the end of communism there. But now we're seeing unions in our country becoming, I think, less powerful, perhaps less important. Certainly they're having fewer members. Gawie Cillié is an analyst at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Gawie, good afternoon to you. Why are unions, and I suppose workers, but unions, under so much pressure at the moment? They seem to be becoming weaker.
I think there's two sets of factors that can be considered. On the one hand, we do see decline in trade union membership figures over the last 10 years or so, which, by the way, is not only a South African phenomenon, but also an international one. And there could be a variety of reasons for that declining membership, which obviously will impact the power position, not exclusively so, but as a contributing factor. The traditional reasons why employees join unions in the past related to their economic needs, their political needs, job security needs, socialization needs, as well as self-actualization, viewing the trade union as an opportunity to establish a career. So one need to ask questions, are those still relevant today? Is the younger generation, employees of South Africa, still interested? Are they still driven by those particular needs? And secondly, one needs to look at what I would call the external environment, of which the current economic situation is maybe the most important one. And I think one of the major factors in the economic environment is that we currently dealing with a lower level inflation scenario, which of course is quite often used as a guide or as a directive when it comes to wage increases, and that's where a lot of the unhappiness from the aggrieved employees are currently coming from. Just going back to your reference to what happened to the president, I think two factors impacted what happened there. One, it was done in the environment where the Savannah Stillwater strike is still ongoing, very, very bitter strike going on there, unresolved at the moment. And secondly, I think that the choice of venue, Rustenburg, was a bad choice. Going back to August 2012, we had the Marikana massacre, and those wounds have not healed. So I would not take the reaction of employees on Workers' Day regarding the president's speech as a kind of a state of the unions currently in South Africa. I think it's more situation specific.
It's an important point that you make there. I mean, there's so many different factors in what happened yesterday, particularly around Rustenburg. I wonder sometimes if the president maybe thought that the political loss of not going might be bigger. But anyway, that's a different conversation. You made the point that unions are losing workers and losing members in other countries too. At the same time, as I understand it, we're seeing in this country and in other countries a concentration in public sector unions. So people who work for government belong to unions. People who work in the private sector do not. Why is this happening?
I think, for example, to organize in the public sector, given the current available human resources infrastructure of trade unions, is a lot easier. You know, when you talk public sector, with the bargaining council set up that you find in the public sector, it's very easy to get all arms of the public sector under one roof, and therefore it makes collective bargaining a lot easier. When it comes to the private sector, it's a lot more difficult because you've got to service and visit individual employers, different sites that you have to go to, which might be one of the reasons why trade unions up to now has been quite reluctant to start recruiting new members in the informal or the gig economy, which I believe is a potential source of new membership. But to be able to do that, you will need a major increase in the number of officials to go around for recruitment purposes.
Does this also lead to a situation where if you have a union with a declining membership, the people who stay in the union, and sometimes the leaders who stay in the union, are more radical? They have a much firmer feeling for their beliefs. Maybe they're more ideological in nature. None of these are pejorative terms. This is just looking for words to describe them. What I'm trying to say is if you have a smaller union, do you sometimes end up with a more hardcore union and more strikes as a result?
Of course, those would be the ones that very strongly believe for ideological or other reasons that they should be in the union. But there's an additional factor, Stephen, that might not be recognized that often. The problem with trade union membership, the moment that representativity, for example, goes to something like 10, 15, 20% in an organization, there's a tendency, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, for the employer not to take the union seriously. Because the question that comes up is, who do you actually represent? You represent a small number of employees, and therefore I'm not going to take you seriously. That might negatively impact when it comes to collective bargaining or negotiation, which leads to conflict. And we currently see at Sibanya, for example, a scenario that should never, ever have allowed to develop over time and not being resolved. It seems that there is two things that contribute to that scenario, and I'm not involved in those negotiations myself. One, I think there's a lack of leadership on both sides, management as well as union, in terms of trying to resolve the matter. And secondly, there's a total lack of creativity in terms of dispute resolution, whether it being third-party involvement through mediation or through problem-solving, investigating other ways of incentivizing workers to actually close the gap between their demands and what management might be offering them.
There's another thing that's happening, I think, in unions, and I think the union word for it, I think, is corporatism. And what I'm talking about is where union leaders no longer live the life of a worker. And I know Zingiswa Losi, the president of COSATU, was very angry when this was put to her yesterday, I understand. She says that that's not true. But sometimes you see union leaders getting a union car, getting a union phone, getting a union residence in some cases. There's sometimes a big fight in certain unions. I think Sepwawu, the chemical workers union, is a good example. And everyone ends up having, all the leaders spend their time fighting over control of the pension fund, for example. How important is that dynamic and what looks like a weakening of unions?
Stephen, that is very, very important. You know, the larger unions get over time, they develop a tendency to develop into bureaucracies. And you know all about bureaucracies. And that creates the biggest concern there. It creates a huge distance between the trade union, let's call it leadership, as well as the members. It's fine, you know, to use the slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all. But in real terms, there is quite a distance between those officials and the membership on the ground. They're sometimes accused of really not being in touch with what the members actually want. You've used examples of how trade union officials not necessarily enrich themselves, but you know, some of them earn salaries, for example, that you can compare to any CEO currently in South Africa, with all the perks and all the benefits, which obviously must aggrieve members. I don't know what trade unions actually do with their membership dues, but most of their financial affairs, in terms of the Department of Employment and Labor, is in shambles. So that does not contribute to transparency, proper management of union affairs.
Well, Gawie, I don't think any institution in the country could afford Neil Froneman right now, but I take the point that you're making. Do you expect this trend of unions getting weaker to continue? Let me just explain sort of why I asked this question. It's easy to point at the dynamics you've pointed to, what we've already discussed in the conversation you and I have had, and say, well, all of these trends are likely to continue, remote working, etc. Unions will possibly get weaker. But sometimes strange things happen. I mean, I could imagine that, for example, in Britain or North America somewhere, someone comes up with a new model of unionism, perhaps, and I know this was a big argument with our unions in apartheid about whether unions should be apolitical or engage in politics. In the end, the apolitical unions lost and the political unions won. It was apartheid. Of course that was going to happen, and so it should have happened. But, for example, could someone come up with a new model of unionism?
That's quite possible, and I want to use two examples. First, going back to your reference to whether they should be involved in politics or not, and I've sometimes expressed a concern, you know, for your large federations to be in bed with the ANC. I do not believe that's such a good idea. I believe trade unions develop their power bases if they're autonomous from government. We see an example a couple of years ago in Zimbabwe. Trade unions got in bed with the existing government, change in government, trade unions are not very popular in Zimbabwe anymore. You mentioned the United States. What have we seen in the United States happening recently? Employees at Amazon. Who could believe that the employees at Amazon would actually start a union? So I think what could happen is in your non-traditional employment areas, not in manufacturing, but in services and a few others, we could see a few developments, but I do believe that the decline will still continue.
Gawie Cillié, thank you very much indeed.